This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We now turn to Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee. Senator Portman earlier served as United States Trade Representative and Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Thank you so much for being back with us, Senator. I want to start with the issue of the day, which is, of course, inflation. Every American, I think, is concerned about inflation right now. And pick up on one of your former jobs, which is United States Trade Representative, and ask specifically, what could we be doing with trade policy that might actually lower some of the cost to consumers?
Well, David, I heard Austin Goolsby's analysis, which I thought was interesting, and he talked about the supply side as well as the demand side, and talked about a consensus of economists maybe on the issue of supply. I think there's also a consensus on the issue of demand, which was that we stimulated demand with an unprecedented amount of stimulus spending a year and a couple of months ago. On the supply side, though, with regard to trade, there are two ideas that I think would be quite helpful. One is to try to, I should say, reduce the cost to consumers by taking a position where there are at least exclusions in the current tariffs that are being applied in the China context. Those exclusions were in place back in the Trump years. That could be done again. That doesn't mean getting rid of the tariffs, which were put in for a good reason. And there's a Section 301 report detailing why, which is that China is not playing by the rules. But then second, and I think most importantly, is to get America back in the game, which means more trade. And that means, one, finishing up the UK trade agreement, which is right on the cusp of being completed. But also entering into what we call plurilateral, meaning multilateral agreements with people through the World Trade Organization that don't have to include everybody, which is the current rule, and allow those to be passed by Congress. As an example, there's a number of discussions right now underway about environmental goods or services. We could come up with agreements on these topics by not saying that it has to be an absolute consensus. Countries that wanted to be part of it could be. That would be a breakthrough and would be extremely important for our long-term economy, for us to have the ability to do that with like-minded countries. So I think there's some things in trade that we should, and I'm not quite sure why we're not doing, that make a lot of sense. My hope is we'll move forward on that.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about, whether there's any progress on any of those fronts. You mentioned discussions being had. Are there any negotiations, whether it involves the Chinese situation or the plurilateral discussions? Are you aware of any actual negotiations pointing in that direction?
Well, no. Unfortunately, the administration's taken the position that they're not interested in what's called Trade Promotion Authority, which gives Congress the ability to not just help negotiate these agreements, but then to take them up on an up or down basis, because countries won't negotiate with you when you think the agreement could be amended to death in the U.S. Congress. This is why trade agreements typically have to have Trade Promotion Authority. They've allowed that to expire. They're not seeking to extend it. That's too bad, because we always want that. Every administration should want it, and every Congress should want it. But then second, they've said they're not interested in new trade agreements, which to me really handicaps us. And that's an extraordinary statement, given the fact that every administration, Republican and Democrat alike, has negotiated trade agreements. And we should get back in the business of doing that. I mentioned the UK because we were so close. We're probably 4/5 of the way there with a good agreement with them that could be a template then for the rest of the EU. But also finishing up a trade agreement with Japan would be incredibly helpful right now. Japan is by far the largest economy in this Trans-Pacific Partnership group. We have trade agreements with most of the members of that group. Having Japan would be incredibly important from an economic point of view, but also a geopolitical point of view vis-a-vis China. And then there's some countries in Africa who've been looking to us to say, can we do a trade agreement with you? And Kenya in particular, I'll be there next month. So my hope is that, we get back in the game here. And it seems to me to be really shooting themselves in the foot for the administration to say that they don't want to move forward on trade agreements. This is something that more exports is a good thing for us and creates jobs and helps our economy.
Senator mentioned the CHIPS Act, which, as I understand it, the Senate is taking up even as we speak right now. It may be passed out of the Senate today. One of the issues that's been raised, actually, is by one of your colleagues, actually, a Republican senator from Florida, Rick Scott, who has said a flaw in this bill is that it would actually allow companies that get money to build plants in the United States for chips to go and expand in China as well. Should we be tougher on China in this CHIPS Act?
Well, we did insert some language that I supported on so-called guardrails to avoid just what you had talked about, and I think that's important. China is very interested, as you know, in investing a lot of money in chips and providing huge incentives, far more than we're talking about in the chips legislation here. And so are other countries, by the way, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, of course. Now the European Union, particularly Germany, has put on the table some very generous incentives for companies to be able to go to Germany rather than come to the United States. So our goal here is to bring this back to America. We're now less than 12% of the chip production in the world. You know, we started this industry. We still do a lot of the design, but the production has gone overseas. And of that 12%, by the way, almost none of it is high-end chips. So from a national security point of view and an economic security point of view, we want to reshore some of this chip production, particularly the higher-end chips, to be able to ensure that we have a reliable access to those supply chains. And my hope is we'll pass it today. I think we will. We just had a very strong vote on the first step in the process, so-called cloture vote, and I think the second vote will probably be tomorrow now. I also hope that we put in additional protections for the research, particularly from adversaries like China who want access to our research that taxpayers are paying for. We got to be sure we're tightening that up. And my hope is we'll do that this afternoon as well.
Senator, finally, you mentioned regulatory reform earlier, and I want to ask you about that. As I say, you were director of Office of Management and Budget, among other positions you had. You know the regulatory situation in Washington these days. We had a Supreme Court decision that I know you know terribly well involving West Virginia EPA, in which the Supreme Court really did put, you might say, guardrails around independent regulatory agencies. I wonder from your perspective, what is the proper role of regulatory agencies acting under acts of Congress? And when have they exceeded that role, which is what essentially I would take the Supreme Court to have said with respect to the EPA?
I can tell you University of Michigan law school degree is serving you well, David. It's a complicated area, and as you know, there's lots of Supreme Court cases about this issue. You know, where does the legislative branch end and the administrative branch begin? The executive branch has been more and more aggressive at taking what Congress passes and then, you know, putting their own details into it. And that's what the Supreme Court was essentially saying, is that, wait a minute, we've got to be sure that the Congress, which is the representative of the people, and under our Constitution, you know, has the authority here to actually change the way we mandate or regulate, you know, has the final say. One of the problems, in my view, broad issue here, is that Congress has provided legislation that does give an opening to the executive branch to do more and more. So Congress needs to be, in my view, more comprehensive, more precise in their legislation, and, you know, let people see what the actual congressional intent is. So that's part of the issue. The other issue is overreaching by the administrative agencies, and that's what the Supreme Court was commenting on. I will say, right now, in terms of this inflationary spiral that we're seeing, which is, you know, already feels like a recession to low and moderate income people in Ohio and people on a fixed income, because wages are not keeping up with inflation by any stretch. And it's not just gas prices, which have gone down a little, which is great, but are still way too high. But it's food, it's clothing, it's everything they're buying. So getting back to that pre-pandemic environment, economic environment, where wages were growing far more than inflation, does require looking at the regulatory side. And smart deregulation, smart permitting reform, as an example, would really help right now. Certainly don't raise taxes, certainly don't put more stimulus into the economy, and get the supply side, you know, in better shape. The Fed can do some things with raising rates, not just on the supply side, but also I would say, per Austin Goolsbee comments, it's not just about supply. When they raise rates, what they're doing is trying to reduce demand as well. A much better way is to put in place the pro-growth policies we had before the pandemic that were working for Americans, particularly working families in Ohio, who were getting ahead and now see that they're getting behind.
Senator, it's always so great to have you with us. Thank you so much. And for the plug for our joint alma mater, University of Michigan Law School, Senator Rob Portman of Ohio. Thanks for being here. And